Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, January 7th, where we are talking about three chapters: delivering speeches, culture, and audience, that I am hopeful will be of assistance to you as you prepare for speech number one, which will be due this Thursday in 2 days if you are watching this video on Tuesday the 7th. Though I suspect that you could utilize all of these principles and techniques for all of the upcoming speeches in class and for speeches as well that you might be doing either in other classes or perhaps in other venues. So I have gone through your discussion forum responses and your introductions, and I would have responded to each of you. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' posts and also my responses in turn. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself since everybody else talked a little bit about themselves. And I was born and raised in New York City. I attended college upstate New York at the University of Rochester, which had advertised itself as a place where students could experience real winters. And oh boy, were there indeed real winters. But I learned to become accustomed to those winters where I majored in English and I minored in psychology. I was absolutely certain I was going to be a lawyer, which goes to show that things can change over the course of your academic studies, because I realized that while I was attracted to law for the money and the prestige, I was very honest about that. Really wasn't interested in the profession itself. What I was interested in was literature. So, what I ended up doing instead of going to law school was going to graduate school. And this time I made sure that I went to a school that did not have real winters. I went to Southern California, UCLA, where I specialized in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I finished up my degree and began teaching and realized that, well, I was missing the winter after all. So I began applying for positions on the East Coast. And in my mind, anything on the East Coast was basically home. And there was a little school that I had never heard of before that was advertising for an English position. The school's name, Greenfield Community College. Well, the rest is history. I came out for an interview and we talked a little bit about what my transition might be like and realized that perhaps the transition wouldn't be that great because after all I was experienced in terms of real winters in upstate New York, and even New York City has winters. I started at GCC in the 1993-94 academic year. And I remember very clearly what I was told during my interview, and that was that the winters in Massachusetts are not that bad. And if you know anything about the 1993-94 academic year, because it was indeed historical, it was one of the worst winters in Massachusetts history. So it was quite the adjustment, but I managed to survive that winter, and I've branched out from teaching English classes to teaching classes in personal communication skills, such as this class, but I also teach a class in interpersonal communications, and I also teach communications classes, classes in media and popular culture, as well as the class in horror film, if you've heard anything about that particular course. So I've got a pretty eclectic range. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of who I am, and perhaps gives you some idea too of how you could proceed with an autobiographical speech. As I had indicated, some of you might want to talk about your educational background, and if you're not necessarily sure what to discuss, that's usually what I recommend. In terms of thinking about the autobiographical speech in today's attendance question, I will have three sample autobiographical speeches for you to view that were posted on YouTube by students like yourselves, in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't need to worry that one day one of your own speeches would be reviewed by a class at GCC. And I'm just going to ask you to view those speeches and to identify a strength and a weakness of each of the speeches. So this also could serve as a kind of model of how to proceed. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I also wanted to talk about the discussion forum question about reducing nerves. And all of you came up with great ideas. I have one suggestion. Actually, scent has been shown to be very powerful in terms of reducing anxiety. So scents such as lavender, for instance, are supposed to reduce nervousness. Now, of course, if you don't care for the scent of lavender, then I wouldn't smell the scent of lavender. But I would oftentimes in my face-to-face classes bring in a small vial of aromatherapy oil of lavender for individuals who did want to take a sniff before delivering their speech. So, in terms of delivering speeches, which is one of the chapters assigned for today, there are different kinds of speeches that you can deliver. And there is the speech that we are delivering, which is the extemporaneous speech, which is a speech that's prepared in advance and it's delivered with a speaking outline. You remember last class we talked a little bit about the distinction between the speaking outline, which is just keywords and phrases, as opposed to the written outline, which is much more detailed. And in the video that I talked about this, I had referred you to the notes below the video. And in fact, I once again refer you to the notes beneath this video because this is literally the outline that I use. I just print out so that I can have a hard copy, which I recommend. Now, other kinds of speeches that you might deliver, depending on the situation, would be an impromptu speech, a spur of the moment with no prior preparation. Think about being given an award that you weren't expecting. Usually, what I recommend is that you try to avoid giving these types of speeches. And certainly, if you are in a situation where you have to give that kind of speech, keep it short. Keep it sweet. You don't want to ramble and leave yourself open for possible errors. There is also the manuscript speech, which is a speech that's read, either literally from a manuscript or even from a teleprompter. This is oftentimes done in academic conferences when you read a paper, or perhaps in the media where you're using a teleprompter where things have to be timed down to the second, say, for instance, a news broadcast. Now, I've never read from a teleprompter, but it requires a certain level of skill so that it looks natural. And what I find is that regardless of the technology that you use, there always is the possibility of malfunction. And I have a great video for you to watch that illustrates that point. You can see this in the notes below under section 1, delivering speeches. And this is the watch teleprompter fail video. It's about 3 or 4 minutes. It happens to be about Michael Bay, a very famous director. And he was talking about his new movie, something that he obviously knew very well. And there was a teleprompter fail, and he panicked and basically ran off stage. So it's not that he didn't know the material, it was that he was relying too much on technology. And then when the technology failed, he didn't have enough presence of mind to be able to take over. So I show that to you as just an example that you might think that read speech or a manuscript speech might be easier. It's not necessarily. And the problem with reading a speech, as the Toastmasters video discussed, is that it oftentimes sounds like you're reading a speech. You're usually monotone and you're not engaged with your audience and making eye contact and so forth. So definitely you do not want to give a manuscript speech in this class. Definitely you do not want to give an impromptu speech in this class because you know the topics ahead of time. So if you're in any way tempted to think, well, I'll just figure out something when I record my autobiographical speech because it's about my life after all, so I'm sure something will occur to me. I encourage you not to do that and to, as many of you indicated in terms of dealing with nerves, really put some thought and effort into the preparation and the practice. So, there is such a thing as a memorized speech, and you might be tempted to do that for this class. Don't, because it'll sound stilted and memorized. And the longer the speech is, the more difficult it is to memorize. Usually we use it for very brief informal occasions. Some of you had mentioned something like toasts at weddings, for instance. That might be an appropriate time to have a memorized speech, but certainly not in our class. So, in terms of delivering speeches, think about your voice. Again, you want to be conversational. You want to vary your volume, your speed, and your inflections so that you aren't speaking in a monotone. You want to enunciate. In other words, you're not mumbling, which is different than pronunciation, which is where you emphasize certain parts of words. Chances are you aren't going to be able to change your pronunciation, and there really isn't any need to as long as your audience can understand what you're saying. In fact, you might, if you're concerned about pronunciation, even tell your audience at the beginning that if they have difficulty understanding your accent, to please send you questions, or to, if it was a live situation, to ask you questions. That puts the burden of responsibility on the audience to pay a little bit more attention. And do pause, because pausing can be very helpful for dramatic effect. Also, it's a great opportunity to breathe, and that really is the number one suggestion I have for reducing nerves, is to take nice deep breaths into the diaphragm. So think about things like proxemics, the use of space. And in a live situation, you're thinking about things like where the podium is, how far the audience is from you, can they see your facial expressions. In terms of video, you want to think about things like your background, your attire, so forth and so on. But this is a discipline in and of itself, proxemics, the use of space. And it's something that can influence how an audience responds to a speech. Affect display are facial expressions, and audience members pay the most attention to your face, which is why when you're recording, you want to make sure that the face is visible, and you want to make sure that you're using facial expressions. And very interesting studies have been done about this. Individuals who have difficulty with social relationships, and no, that's not you if that's what you're thinking. I'm talking about people who really have difficulty functioning on a day-to-day basis in society, were found to misjudge facial expressions, which tend to be pretty universal. That generally speaking, a smile signifies happiness, and a frown signifies unhappiness. And again, you could have a wry smile or a sad smile, but when they were shown pictures of facial expressions, they were misidentifying the expression, saying that a smile was unhappy and a frown was happy. It would make a certain level of sense why they're having difficulty with social relationships if they can't read these sorts of social cues. Gesturing is important as well. And it's a question of, again, how much can we see in the camera, but you don't want to appear stiff on the camera, and also you don't want to be fidgeting on the camera so that it appears that the audience is spending more time thinking about your gestures than they're thinking about your message. And that's really the case, is that you want to make sure that the audience isn't necessarily focused on the idea that you're rocking back and forth, or that you're saying too many times. Everybody says it's a way to oftentimes get breath. So I suggest that you just quietly take a breath in those instances. But when it gets to the point where the audience is focusing on that rather than your message, then it's become excessive. And in terms of gesture, some of them are conventional. In other words, meaning has been assigned by custom. So for instance, something like the OK sign, which would be something like this. And that is not necessarily universal. If you know anything about Brazil, that's considered to be an insult. So it's just a group of people who have basically decided that a certain sign has a certain meaning. Descriptive, those are usually more universal when you're showing size and when you're showing shape. For instance, very good to describe what something looks like. And then there are indicators, things that express feelings. For instance, slamming your fist on a table to emphasize a point. And eye contact, generally speaking, eye contact shows that you are engaged with your audience. This varies across cultures as well. In some cultures, eye contact is considered disrespectful. So you need to know who your audience is, which gets us to the next two chapters that I had assigned: culture and also audience. In terms of culture, there are lots of definitions for culture. Probably the best definition, certainly the broadest, is that it's any group membership. And I guess we can debate whether or not two people are just a pair or a group, but three or more certainly is a group. And if you are belonging to that particular group, there are probably predictive elements associated with the members of that group. Now, they aren't necessarily universal. That's when we get into trouble with stereotypes, assuming that everybody in the group is the same. But there probably are some commonalities between the group members. So, things like behaviors, their actions, and this is usually something that is visible that you can see. Um, Even something like your conversational style can be influenced by culture. There are some cultures that are more direct and to the point, Western cultures like the United States, for instance. And then there are other cultures that are less direct and rely more on storytelling, for instance, Asian cultures. Again, we want to be careful not to stereotype. Attitudes are something else that you can oftentimes identify through cultural or group membership. These are the feelings that a group has. I can just about guess that your typical college student thinks that college textbooks are too expensive. The belief of something that is true or false, and ultimately the value, which is basically everything. It's the belief of thinking that something is true or false. It's the attitude, the feeling that you've got about something. And it also is the behavior that you show towards something. Values, because they include so many elements, oftentimes are very highly resistant to change. This will be important for us when we get specifically to the persuasive speech, where you might be trying to persuade an audience of something where their values are so firmly embedded that they are not going to change their minds. And I've oftentimes said that the test is not that everybody agrees with you. The test is that people respect you. And I really think that's the key. When we talk about multicultural, which is really what our society is that we belong to many cultures, many co-cultures, and some are larger than others. When we think about things like race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or religion or political affiliation or age, those are usually the biggies. But they can become very specialized. Pug lovers, for instance. I happen to have a pug, and I'm definitely part of that culture of the pug lover. For better or for worse, our class is a culture. We have formed a group membership. And because of that, there are certain commonalities that we share and certain predictive elements. But of course, we all have a certain level of individuality as well. And all of this is related to your evaluating audience when you are delivering a speech. And this specifically is called demographics, the observable characteristics of individuals in a group. Things like age or gender or ethnic background or education or political affiliation or religion. The media spends a lot of time analyzing demographics because they have to determine what advertising is going to appeal most to what group. And the text talks a little bit about how to deal with a hostile audience. I doubt you'll ever be in a situation where you've got to present to a hostile audience. Usually that occurs, and you know very well that you're walking into that situation. For instance, in a political speech where you are presenting to the opposition. But you might encounter a skeptical audience, and I would say that the techniques are perhaps similar. And I don't have a magic bullet or panacea for how to go about dealing with the skeptical or hostile audience. All I can do is to give suggestions. But establishing goodwill is usually one way to proceed, that there isn't any ill intent that is obvious or not so obvious. Establish areas of agreement. That there might be areas of disagreement, but let's at least focus on those areas in which we agree. Use credible outside sources, because that helps to give ethos and ethical reliability and validity to your argument. And you will be using outside resources when it comes to the third speech, where you will be dealing with controversial topics and might have a skeptical audience. Be professional. So you can earn the audience's respect in that you're well prepared and that you know your information and that you're professional, even though the audience might disagree with your particular perspective. Use humor. That's supposed to be, one of the great universals is humor. The thing is that humor can vary from individual to individual, certainly from culture to culture. So you need to be careful with humor that you don't end up offending. And be multi-sided, what I call addressing the elephant in the room, where I've seen both writers and speakers that are trying so hard to support their argument that they act as if there are no other perspectives. And rather than do that, which just usually annoys, if not angers, the other perspective, at least acknowledging that that perspective exists and maybe that even it has some validity, but the perspective that you are putting forward has greater strength, that can certainly earn audiences respect. Usually people just want to be acknowledged. So if you go to the top folder of our Moodle site in the syllabus and other documents folder, you will see a speech rating sheet. This is the sheet that I'm going to be using when I evaluate your first speech. And again, I encourage you to make hard copies of all of the photocopies in that folder. And I wanted to talk briefly about this speech ratings sheet, which is divided up into two categories. The first is content, and then the second happens to be delivery. So in terms of content, and hopefully all of this sounds familiar because we've been talking about this the last few classes, the introduction. So are you getting your audience's attention? You notice that there's a ranking here from none to excellent. And it could just be as simple as greeting your audience and then transitioning to your thesis or some sort of a preview statement. And again, we go from none to excellent. And then the body, and that is the middle portion of your speech. It could also be called the discussion section. That's what the Toastmasters video called it. Do you have a clear pattern? Does it make sense how you are connecting things? Are your main points stated, and are you developing those points? Do you have voice mannerisms, things like ums and ahs, or words that you repeat frequently, such as like? Again, those filler words oftentimes are used to give yourself a moment to think about how to proceed or perhaps to get some oxygen into you. And I just encourage you to take a silent pause and remember that varying your speed can be very helpful to an audience. And do you have well-chosen words? And we talked a little bit about this last class, that you won't have the precision that you would have, let's say, with writing a paper. You don't necessarily have to feel obligated to state something exactly word for word unless you're quoting. You just want to have the general concept of it. And I oftentimes liken it to preparing for an important conversation. Let's say asking an employer for a raise, and that you wouldn't necessarily be reading from a manuscript as to why you need a raise. But you have some general ideas. And then, of course, the wording of it is going to be based on what happens in the moment and the sorts of give and take that occur between you and the employer. But as long as you're able to communicate your main points, the precision of the language is less important. And then finally, your conclusion. Do you have some sort of summary and restatement, or also do you have do you have a concluding statement that gives a sense of closure, which could just be thanking your audience? And then finally, the delivery. Things like, as we were talking about today, eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, articulation. In other words, how clearly are you speaking? You're not mumbling. Your enthusiasm. Even if you're not enthusiastic, pretend to be enthusiastic. If you're not enthusiastic, why should we be enthusiastic? So I suggest that this outline might help you with evaluating the speeches of others, but it will also help you in terms of thinking about your first speech. I don't even bother to use this template with the second and the third speech. I just use it with the first, since we're still learning the basics of how to deliver a speech. And then I just take freehand notes of the second and the third speech. So in terms of where we are headed over the semester, upcoming assignments. tomorrow, so that would be Wednesday the 8th, I will be posting quiz number 1. That will be 20 questions. It will be short answer, multiple choice, and true false. It's open book, open notes, and based on the material that I've talked about in the videos and the material that's discussed in the videos. Once you are done with taking that quiz, and you have 24 hours in which to submit that quiz. If you were taking it in class, you would actually do it in class. But I wanted to give you the equivalent of a week, which is what a one class is in an intersession. So you've got 24 hours to submit that. I'm going to ask you, as you will see when I post the quiz next class, to send that via PDF to my email, because that's how my grading program works best. My email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. This is also a wonderful time that if you wanted to have some sort of optional practice with me, this would be a great opportunity to do it. So if you are thinking about trying out your speech, contact me. And we could do this via email if you'd like to do it that way, or Zoom or telephone if you'd like to do it that way. Not required, but certainly the offer is there. I will be asking you at the ending of quiz 1, what are you thinking about doing your first speech with? Because I wanted to get a sense of everybody's topic. And then finally, on Thursday, the 9th, is when you will be posting speech number 1, your 5-minute autobiographical speech. And as I indicated, you should do it in one take. What I will do is I will post directions next class on how to upload your speech to YouTube. And then I will also post a folder on our Moodle site in the top general section, where you can post speech number 1. And you have up until midnight to do that. And it's important to hand in that speech, or to upload that speech, I should say, by the due date, because the following class, your attendance question is going to be to view all of the speeches of your classmates and to send me one strength and one weakness via email. So it'll be confidential, but I wanted you to learn not just from delivering your own speech, but by watching the speeches of others. And then I can compile all of that, and I can share with you what was one of the more popular strengths and weaknesses for each of the speeches. So we can begin practicing doing something like that with today's attendance question. And this is going to be due on our discussion form. And you are going to be asked to watch 3 sample autobiographical student speeches that were posted on YouTube. Now, they're all different lengths, so we can't necessarily evaluate it based on the 5-minute criteria that I've given you. Some are as short as 3. I believe one is 6 minutes. And volume is a little tricky as well, because ultimately we're working with being able to manipulate our own volume. Certainly you want the recording to be clean enough so that we can hear the volume. Certainly you want the lighting to be clear enough so that we can see your face. And you'll see that these 3 speeches are autobiographical speeches, and all of these speakers have gone about their autobiographical speech in different ways. Just going to ask you to identify a strength and a weakness. It can just be a word or two in the discussion form. Again, you're not required necessarily to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class if we were meeting face-to-face. We would have used these 3 sample autobiographical student speeches as case studies. And we'll do the same when the time comes for the informative and also for the persuasive speech. So as you know, you've got 24 hours for your discussion form response, but if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So one last time, please list one strength and weakness from each of the sample autobiographical speeches. And next class, I will be posting our quiz, as well as more information on how to upload your speech. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. And believe it or not, We have, if I am correct, completed the first month of the semester. Things do go quickly in the intercession. Take care. Bye-bye.